Okay, Imperium Romanum II. This one has been on my short list for a long time. Pretty much the point where I had a list at all, which was when my games got shipped back from the East Coast. I don't know, 2011, 2010, somewhere in that range, very close to when I started videoing. And I kind of settled into the idea of, yeah, I'm in my permanent place now. I own it. I might as well get my games back since I've been missing them for so long. Anyway, this one made it up to Eugene before the recent shipment of stuff, because it has been on that short list. It also is really got a lot of thumbs over on the BGG request list, which of course anything that I add now gets like 6 thumbs or less. So if you are one of my viewers and you haven't visited that list and tried, just look through the compendium of all the games rather than, there's basically 2 views. You can view it as just a simple list, and it's just a couple pages then, and you can look for the couple of things that you'd really want to see and thumb those. Because I know that some of the newer stuff I've picked up is attractive to some of you, but I've got no input to how much, and I've got to relate it to the stuff that was, I don't know, thumbed when people were first watching and paid attention to that list. Okay, anyway, what about my relationship to this game? It's a West End game. It's the original was as well. I've never seen it, but basically the same concept. The idea is a bunch of scenarios, 33 of them, which cover the history, the main campaigns within the Roman Imperial era, but it does start with a few in the Republican era, not going back to the Punic War or anything, which is kind of a shame. That would be useful. Let us talk a little bit, let's talk a little bit more about history of the game, at least my history with the game. This was one that was very exciting to me. Its only big shortfall was there's no campaign game built for it. There are rumors, and West End, the designer Al Nafi actually said, look, we tried, man, but we couldn't come up with something that worked. Apparently the attempt was made with something similar to what was used in Grand Sequel, which is kind of you do some abstract stuff and you get kind of a scenario generator out of it for the different scenarios, as opposed to maybe a real campaign game that fitted together. And I could kind of see that working. I toyed with the idea of trying to use Republic of Rome as sort of a campaign that this would erupt when a war erupted of any kind. The problem with that is, of course, Republic of Rome is from the earlier era, more the Republican era, although some of the scenarios, the later decks get you into some of the stuff here. So you have the Marius versus Sulla era and stuff. There weren't all that many big civil wars, and this game is largely focused on the idea of civil wars, although it does cover the declining era where you have the empire split in half, but both sides kind of fighting off the barbarians. And then trying to come up with some way to represent the emergence of imperial power struggles. It just didn't make sense to me. So basically, the best I could come to was kind of you play these in order and allow, if Rome expands or contracts, to reflect that in the scenario somehow. And I just decided it wasn't really worth pursuing any further. So that's probably the biggest negative that I have about the game, which has to do with, you got a bunch of these scenarios, but you don't have something that really kind of lets you. I've always been into the let's try to capture history through games. So other people have mentioned this as well on Board Game Geek. The concept of, well, let one game inform into the other, kind of like the Paradox EU-based games have managed to do. Hey, let me play. I think there's a Roman one now or something. But let me play Europa Universalis and let that go into Victoria and let that go into, Heart of Iron. But you really need a World War One in there. There wasn't a clear place there. And just allow the countries to kind of, whatever the peace conditions are, to kind of get hashed out in between and try to fix the things under those conditions. Well, I don't know. Having done it on the computer where it's easier to do and played those, running one into the other, I'm less excited about it than I used to be. And I realized I would have to do a lot of manual tinkering to get these to work. And you actually do with the computer as well. Anyway, the game covers the Mediterranean area. You got a bunch of counters. Now I've sorted out what I need for the first scenario, which isn't necessarily the first scenario you should play. There's a couple of introductory scenarios, which come time-wise in the middle of... So this is November. This goes in 53. So you got to kind of keep an eye out. That one shows up between 3 and 4. If you want to play those. Those are kind of stripped down scenarios that don't use a lot of rules, a lot of factions. I think they're both 2-player scenarios. But they're good ways to get your feet wet in the game, as it were. There are some things about this game that maybe require a little bit of getting used to. But honestly, I used to bring this sucker to my gaming group when I was in Buffalo. And most of us, it was basically half wargamers, half non-wargamers. So you'd have guys who were cool on playing Civ or 18XX, Britannia, stuff like that. But they really weren't usually happy with the idea of a war game. And amongst the non-war gamers, I'd say we got about a 50-50 acceptance rating for this game. It's an okay game from their standpoint. And some of them were just very, very much out of their league in terms of, but it doesn't really require a whole hell of a lot of prior wargame experience in terms of, operational style games or operational strategic like it is, and that usually have this, I got to protect every other hex and worry about all kinds of things like that and try to balance my forces and everything. Those kind of ideas don't really flow with this because the ancient period. And the rules were still simple enough to be accessible. There's a lot of economic stuff going on in it that, is easy enough to grasp if you're a normal gamer. The components, one of the things that always irritated me about this one was it was kind of glossy on gloss. The map has kind of a glossy finish. It's slick. And then the counters are super glossy and very, very slick and not all that attractive. I mean, they're not bad, but they would look a lot better with a matte finish. They would also slide a lot less. They're also very thin. I like aspects of them being thin. It means they stack in my counter tray a little easier, you know. They don't take up as much space. The actual stacks stay kind of small, but it does make grabbing the correct counter maybe a little harder than it has to be. Although I find the tweezers work very well with these. I've had trouble with tweezers on modern counters for some reason. They still are working on these, maybe in part because I haven't clipped the corners on these fuckers. I just trimmed the edges. Damn side-mounted counters. Tremendous amount of research went into this in sort of a way that you kind of wonder, was it all needed for the game? Let's talk about the usage of the components. First of all, well, what about pieces? Pieces have a strength and a movement allowance, pretty standard stuff. The other number up there is just an ID number. On the reverse side, most of the units, they're basically half strength on the reverse, but these aren't step losses. Those are indicating untrained units. The exception to that is navies, where they actually are steps. Each counter can hold up to 2 fleets. You have leader counters here, and they have a leadership bonus and a movement allowance. Supply wagons, which can hold up to 4 supply points, and they basically, well, wait, 3 and sort of a 4th. We'll get to that. Some plunder markers, which I don't know why I've got in 2 different spaces. I'm going to need more counter tray space. Fortifications, they're building the fortifications, and then on the other side, and those are kind of points. These are some unaligned leaders because they cross counter mixes. A whole bunch of different counter mix colors, some control markers. There's more counter mix in here, but not a whole lot. This scenario eats up a lot of the stuff. Look at should we get to the map? Yeah. All right, the map obviously has some boxes to hold troops in. It's your normal hex map. Distinguishing, this indicates always good weather. The axe indicates a deforested region. These are wheat, indicating, well, corn in Roman terms, right? For whatever reason, I don't know why. I don't know why the term corn is used in English translations. It should be grain. But for some reason, corn is used. We call it maize. And it confused the hell out of me when I was young. Still does in a way. Where are we? Okay, one of the most interesting things about the map, there are cities that are always on the map, and there are cities that aren't on the map. So for example, look here, this tells us which direction to look for a given period. This city does not exist at all in period 1. In period 2 it exists. And this 28, I think, means in period 6, from 28 on, it's not going to exist anymore. It's been destroyed. And that's, hey, why is Carthage there? Well, because Carthage more or less was not really destroyed all that much. Yeah, so that is more or less their way of representing some of the changes over time. Others, and we got our terrain effects chart here, which is pretty simple. With the terrain key. Time track, a little track to indicate phase within the turn. Okay. Other instances that are covered in here in the charts and tables, if I recall correctly. A bunch of charts charts and tables here. The mobilization, which is the number of troops that are available in each sort of provincial area. What's a provincial area? Well, Italy's a provincial area, but like Cisalpine and Narbonese Gaul are combined into one. I'm not quite sure what the term is. They're one mobilization area. There's actually two provinces in the game terminology. And these restrict how many, or indicate how many troops you can build as a Roman, for the most part, out of that area. And it's not just you. Everybody is limited by that value who's a Roman faction. And you share the same force pool. So if you both own territories in there, you might be splitting the forces involved. I'm not seeing what I want. Well, maybe it is on those charts. No. Okay. So here it gives the tax value of all the provinces on a per scenario basis. The thing I'm looking for is there's a series of maps, which I don't know where it sits. What the maps show you, there they are. What the maps show you is some key information on a territory by territory basis. So for in periods 1 and 2, it's going to show you whether or not there are roads in a province and whether or not it's a wild province or a cultivated province. And you've got to kind of look, there's a differentiation between these that's kind of hard for my eyes to see. Maybe it's better on the camera, but it doesn't look it on my rather unclean view screen. And that's going to change over time as the empire expands its infrastructure, basically. Now, roads is going to affect the movement rates in the different regions. And the cultivated status is going to affect your forage capabilities in the different regions. Over here on the movement chart, it divides into provinces with roads and provinces without roads, because like I said, it's the movement effects there. But it also, movement effects are affected by summer and winter. And then the river, there's going to be the first turn of spring, all the rivers flood, and they increase in movement cost at that point. The exception to that is the Nile, which has its own specific flooding rules. And we'll go on. We'll hit the rules. I don't know that I'm going to go too deeply into the specifics of the rules on this one, simply because there's a fair amount of rules, and I'm also fairly comfortable with them. But when we start getting to some of the rules, they become, they're not applied in all the scenarios, and that's one of the things that's kind of weird here. Like I said, the main sequence of play is here. It runs, you have these interphases every 3 months in March, June, September, and December. You have a mobilization phase. What happens is you're allowed to tax, build new units, and then you make a roll if you're playing with the random events optional roll for each power to see if something funky happens. I'm of course going to play with that. There's a lot of chrome in this game that adds randomness, and given how some of the scenarios feel kind of flat, it's one of the ways of making the game a little bit more interesting. I do like the game, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't quite provide as much as I want out of it. Then you're allowed to chatter with diplomacy, and then each player gets to take his turn. And this is a standard, although it's a multiplayer game, I go, you go type of thing. Each player gets their turn in sequence, and that is not randomized. Might help to randomize them. First, you get to move your navies, and there's interception opportunities there. Then there's land movement with interception opportunities. You have to check your supply. If you're not in supply, units are destroyed. Any units you can't maintain supply for will be destroyed. This is the mechanically painful part of the game, because you're going to have to be worrying about the forage chart. That's basically how many units you can have in a hex. Well, how many stacking points. Stacking points are defined as 1 for light infantry, and double for cav, so light cav is 2. And if something's heavy, it is multiplied by 4. So heavy infantry is 4 times 1 is 4. Heavy cavalry 4 times 2 is 8. And then baggage and fleets both just come in as 4. Post-reform legions become cheaper. They're not considered fully heavy units. And that's about it. Now, if you look here, you compare whether it's cultivated or wild, the season that it's in, and the type of terrain it is, and you get a number of stacking points that each person can have in that hex. Cities, if you control, if you're not like locked outside besieging it or something, add to the total number of steps that you can, or stacking points you can have in a hex. However, if you're within a certain range of a port and you can link back to another port, you're pretty much in supply, which means along the coasts, huge armies can travel as long as there are a reasonable number of ports along the way. And you can also kind of move out off the coast a little bit, but the coastlines become incredibly important because of the supply effects. Finally, you have the supply wagons, which allow you to push into deeper areas like Gaul or Germania, where you wouldn't normally be able to run your supplies. There is not, to my knowledge, a good representation of the river supply network that was used. And I find this one of the negative points in the design for something that actually, the designer's notes make it clear that Mr. Nafi really did a lot of work on researching not just, the military side of things, but to what degree he could, and there's very sparse information on this, the economic side of things, a lot on the military side of the logistics, and as well about, population movements and everything in order to generate those charts that show you the roads and the cultivated setup and the points for the cities and all that. All of that's really based on a huge amount of research, or else he's doing a tremendous job of bullshitting. No, I mean, that kind of, when I read designers' notes like that, I realize, this is why I can't design a historical game, because I'm not willing to put that effort in. And then the question becomes, is it worthwhile for me to try to design a core model on kind of a fantasy-based game? Not necessarily swords and sorcery or something, but one that isn't so deeply grounded in, actual historical things. And of course, I've tried, but I don't even have the effort for that. Anyway. All right, a given player might control more than one power. In general, a major power is aligned, each player is aligned with one major power, but sometimes players only have minor powers. It's conceivable that, at least in some configurations of play, that one player will have multiple major powers just to make some of the scenarios work in different numbers. And the little scenario chart gives you the number of players for the scenario, the maximum, the minimum you should play with, and the optimum number. The one that we're playing with, the optimum number is the minimum of 3. And I think we'll probably do that because it gives the Mithridates player a little bit more power to affect Roman events and to interfere in the Civil War. It may be that stripping that away is fair, though, because they say it's a little unbalanced in favor of the Mithridates player. So maybe I'll consider the 4-player game. Okay. In some cases, there are minor powers that aren't really intended for the scenario or that follow sort of a general rule, which is whoever's furthest away from it. This is when something's kind of neutral and somebody starts interfering in it, going to war or whatever. Whoever's furthest away from that minor power gets to control it. That can change. The decision is made at the beginning of the minor power's action choice, and then, if things change during that, it doesn't immediately revert, but the next time it may change. Something called the power form. We have a copy of it here, and I have made some up on cardboard or on giant index cards, and they allow you to list all the provinces and their tax value, your color or colors, and the combat effectiveness rating of the color. That's the A and B here. Keep track of your treasury and morale values that change, and then any minor powers that you control as well. All of that is important information. There's a fair amount of bookkeeping in this game, but I found that it worked okay. I may end up considering whether or not to use poker chips or something for treasury. The problem is, treasury is not the most important thing. There's basically 2 values that are really important: treasury and morale. Treasury, well, that's how you recruit units and everything, but morale can win or lose you the game. And I may just keep track of them both on paper, simply because that's what I'm used to doing. I would basically need 2 sets of chips to keep both of them. And I don't have something that makes that easy. I could use numeric counters as well, but I don't know. We'll think about how we want to do it. And since there are so many scenarios, we may try different alternates. It's just in this, I've always used paper and pencil previously. Talked about the different units. In general, you have a force pool, which I've got over on the sides of the board. These units are out of play. They're just the counter mix that's available for other scenarios. All right. When you get a taxation phase, you're allowed to tax your provinces for their value. And you collect that money, and then you're allowed to spend some of that money when you mobilize units. Now, mobilization is complex in this game. I think there's 4 different systems, but there are 3 basic systems. Romans is the first, and we're going to see this the most. The way Roman mobilization works, it's based on a combination of these mobilization charts. And now I have made temporary mobilization charts, made mobilization charts for the periods that I don't mind marking up to write on. And basically what happens is these values that are listed here are how many of a particular unit type you can create over the course of a year under the Roman mobilization table. Now, it lists the different areas, and those are defined sometimes, so like here, Hispania 2, somewhere or another here. It tells you what's included in Hispania over there. The CER level, the combat effectiveness rating. When you recruit a unit, it has a certain combat effectiveness rating. Each color in the game has a combat effectiveness rating assigned to it in the scenario. You cannot recruit units from an area that has a lower CER than the color that you're recruiting the units from. Now, in this game, in this scenario, Marius and Sulla both have an ACER, which means they will not be able to recruit anything from any areas that have a B CER value. So Africa Proconsularis is a worthless area. Historically, that's where Marius got shoved for a while. You also have each type of unit you can build. So in Italia, you can build 3 2010s and 4 1610 legions, as well as 2 412 infantry. Now, the parenthesized indicate archer infantry. Archers are an optional rule, but the parenthesized units are not. They're a separation in the counter mix for most scenarios, whether or not you count them as actually being archers. And likewise, we have some cav and some ships. When you mobilize a unit, you have to mark a tick next to this, and there has to be room for it. You're allowed to mobilize units that are lesser, but of the same type. So legions are all of the same type, so if you're allowed to build a 2010, you can instead build a 1610 in its place. But you can't eat up the 2010 production artificially that way, if you get what I'm saying. Fleets, when you build a fleet, you have to mark a legion off as well as the fleet, because the manpower for the fleet comes from the legion, but there's also a limitation on how many ships you can actually build in a province. And somewhere we have a cost, or maybe I think it's derivable. I think it's based on stacking points. All right. Mobilization chart lists costs. I didn't see that. Costs, yeah, okay, so a 2010 always costs you 4, a 1610 costs you 3, and that's how many talents you build it. Most units appear on the map when you build them. Ships, I believe, have a different role. Now, only in March do you actually pay the costs listed. On the other mobilization terms, you pay twice the cost for building the unit. There's some limits as to where you can build units. Let's see. we got here? You can only build if you control the province and you have one of your leaders there in the actual province. Has to go in an unbesieged city. No more than 2 units can be placed in each city in a mobilization phase. And when the unit is placed, it's placed on its unseasoned, weaker side. And you're going to have to season it in combat in order to get it up to its full strength side. All right. You're limited by counter mix. Now, I may be missing some counters. This is an old game that I brought to a lot of places. I'm not absolutely, in fact, I'm pretty certain I am missing at least 1 counter in the whole set because I remember being bummed out at one point. But there was a red counter that was not in the red counter bag that I found. So who knows, maybe I'm lucky. There's no limit by area on baggage trains. However, you're only allowed as many baggage trains as you have leaders. Fleets. Fleets are not unseasoned. Each fleet is an 1830, 18-30, not this unit. The 3630 is 2 fleets. It takes 3 months when you build a fleet. You have to write down which city, which port you're building it in. And like I said, you had to assign a legion. You have to tick off a legion when you mobilize a fleet. Okay, that's one of maybe there's only 3. One of the different mobilization rules. The next one is recruiting by accrual. This is usually barbarian powers have this. All it is they're given a certain amount of stacking points of replacement units that they can get. And here the Lusitanians will be using recruiting by accrual as an example. They have no additional units off map. When they lose units, they can start accumulating replacement points to rebuild those units. And I believe those just come during taxation. They don't give you a doubling cost or anything like that. You just keep getting the hordes coming in. Let me jump to the other thing because we're going to see that in this next scenario and in most scenarios. I don't know why it's tucked away in the special rules. But first I got to swap batteries. The other rule is civilized recruitment. Now, civilized recruitment is a combination of accrual and what else? And money. So you'll be spending your accrual points as well as cash for whatever reason. They don't use the mobilization limits. You'll see a special exception in this scenario, but and that's sort of the other. They do have to train in season as well. And we haven't had training yet. Training only applies in certain scenarios, and it won't be in the one we're looking at. But basically, what happens is the civilized units have a replacement point pool as well as a cash pool. They have to spend both on the units. They are allowed to buy units of the same types, and the Romans are the same way, of the same types that they have at the beginning of the scenario up to their countermix limits. So Mithridates is civilized. Some of Mithridates' units use civilized recruitment, and you can see I've got extra force pool in place for that. All right. I don't know why that's bopped off in its own little place. seasons are a pretty simple concept. Naval operations. During your naval operation phase, you can try to move by sea. Well, you can succeed in moving by sea. Your movement allowance is 30 for fleets. You pay movement point costs as you do with everything, looking up the weather. You don't worry about roads in the water, and whether or not it's a coastal or a deep sea hex. If you're outside of the Mediterranean, and that includes the Black Sea, all movement point costs are doubled above and beyond the deep sea thing. So fiddling around in Britain and stuff. Ouch, right? There are rules of common sense here. You can't sail up rivers, which isn't necessarily common sense, but you also can't sail across land and stuff like that. And some of them are actually worded very much that way. Like, don't do anything stupid, don't do anything unreasonable. I love it when rules are like that. It makes me so much happier. Okay, now when you're in winter, not only are the movement point costs higher, but when you finish your movement, you have to look at the naval attrition table. And generally, I just don't do this. However many movement points you expend, you have an attrition value. If you roll less than or equal to the naval attrition value, the fleet is eliminated. Otherwise, the fleet is safe. Now, what about that modifier? Because I don't like that. +1 if fleet moves while besieging. Yeah, I think that's +1 to the attrition value, not to the die roll. Therefore, more likely to cause a problem. So if you were in a siege situation, if you were blockading the enemy during a siege, and you move, well, you've been at sea for a while, even though you're on a land hex. There's another rule that I forgot to mention. If you began your turn in a sea hex, you must end that movement in a coastal hex, or you will be destroyed. Fresh water, food, all that you got to get. Otherwise, you're in supply, and everything loaded on you is in supply when you're at sea. Okay. You can carry units. In 1830, you can carry 4 stacking units of land units. But and that can be split in the case of the 3016. Leaders are free, as they are for attrition and everything else. You can disembark in a friendly port for 2 movement points, in a non-port hex in a friendly province for 6 movement points, in friendly ports under siege, as long as you want, if you expend 10 or less movement points while embarking, carrying, and disembarking, you can move the land units with their full movement allowance as well during the land movement phase. If you spend 11 or more movement points sailing around with those land units, and that's a little strange. I'll explain why there's a time distortion there. So I could sail up, pick up units, move them by sea, across a short strait, and then they get their full movement allowance, even though my boats maybe used up all their movement to get me to there. That disturbs me, but that's how it works. I might want to tweak that. You can keep your units loaded as long as you like. But anyway, if you spend 11 or more movement points, the land units won't be allowed to move. Okay. In a few cases, in certain scenarios, but in general, if you have a +2 or +3 leader, you may do an amphibious invasion. It costs 6 movement points. It doesn't matter whether there's a port or not, and only leaders and infantry get disembarked during an amphibious invasion. The land units which amphibious invade cannot move that turn. This can be done onto a hex containing enemy units, fortifications, or an enemy city or port. You must attack that resource in the same game turn, and the invading units will be halved in addition to any other modifiers. If there are enemy fleets, you can't amphibious invade, but you could drive the fleets off beforehand. Okay, interception. And this is important because this is going to kind of work with land as well. Naval rules, we don't care about those, but we need to know this, right? That's so much how I think, unfortunately. Whenever a fleet moves to a hex within 6 movement points of an enemy fleet, the enemy player can attempt an interception. You can't intercept in the deep sea. The fleet has to be in a friendly, unbesieged port to attempt interception. So you can't station them out in the water and hope to catch somebody. When you attempt interception, you count the number of movement points between them. You roll a die. If you roll greater than or equal to the distance, you get an interception. You can roll for multiple units at once. Intercepting units take naval attrition if they have to, before the combat. No, after the combat, something like that. And there will be a naval combat which happens immediately with the intercepting player as the attacker. Okay. If you're going to do multiple interception attempts, you have to announce them all, and some of them may or may not succeed, and you might get caught in a stupid way. I think. I'm not sure. If multiple people want to intercept the same space, we looked that up, right? The first player to declare they want the interception gets the first shot at it. And if they don't succeed, the second player can try. Okay. And this is done on a per hex basis, so you could get several interception attempts if some of them are failing, whatever. Okay, naval combat. Naval combat's actually pretty simple. Each player calculates their total naval combat strength, which is the strength of all the fleets, the strength of all light and missile infantry, and half the strength of heavy infantry. Cav do not get to fight. You compare and get a ratio. There's a naval combat results table. You make a roll, and the results are, are quarters of your fleet that you lose, attacker and defender. So if I'm on 3-1 and I get an 8 somehow, I will wipe out the enemy. But here, for example, on the 3-2, the attacker would lose 1/4 of their fleet, rounded up. The defender, half their fleet, rounded up. If you don't have enough capacity to, and this is just fleet units, if you don't have enough capacity to carry all the ground units you have on board, some of them drown. Whoever lost the most total fleets, that could be weird depending on what the roll turns out, they're placed back in the nearest friendly port. Both players tie, they both run away. If that fleet is more than 10 movement points away, the losing force does not move, it loses an additional fleet. If the player whose turn it is wins the battle, they can keep moving, but they cannot initiate a naval combat in this phase. And morale will get assessed. All right, cultivation and roads. This is pretty simple, and I've shown you the charts it affects. It affects the movement chart, and it affects the foraging chart. And that's all you need to really know. And they're fixed for a scenario. Land movement. Land movement, we got our costs over there. There's also interception in land movement. You need a non-phasing leader to attempt interception. The leader decides which units go with him. He doesn't have to bring everything. He can't do it if he's besieged, or all kind of other reasonable rules that we have to just assume. They're in here. It's just I don't want to go into spelling everything out. There has to be a path of no more than 3 hexes in length. You count the number of movement points between the leader's hex and the target. You double this number, roll a die, add the leader's value. Remember, they have numbers ranging from like -4 to +2, but generally 0 to +2. There may be +3s. Okay. So you count the movement points, you double, you roll a die, add the leader's value, and if it gets greater than or equal to the calculated number, you have an interception. If only cav units are intercepting, you get +3 to the die roll. If you decide to bring a baggage train on your interception attempt, you subtract 3 from the die roll. This could be important because your baggage wagon might be necessary for you to be able to keep supply. The land combat doesn't happen immediately. It'll happen during the land combat phase. The phasing player can add more units to the hex. The non-phasing player may attempt additional interceptions, but the intercepting player will be the attacker. Once one player's units have intercepted a stack, another player can't try to intercept it, because you'd end up with a stupid 3-way battle. Force march. If you begin the movement stacked with units and you remain with them throughout your movement, the stack may force march. The movement of non-cav units is increased by 1 plus the leader's leadership value. However, you have to roll a die, and if you roll greater than 1 plus the leader's value, you lose a unit of your choice from the stack. Whew. I need a break. My throat is killing me. Supplies. I'm beginning to think we may need to do this in 2 videos. That's fine. Because I don't like the idea of a 2-hour intro, but all right. During supply, you have to make a check during your attrition, but you also have to make a check if you make an interception. And this is kind of painful. Remember that thing about intercepting with the baggage? Well, you may have to take that. It may be hard for you to intercept the enemy force. Okay, so ports allow you to trace supply back to them. You have to have another port on the same sea area in order to get it. However, that can only provide supply to a unit within 4 movement points of that port. And it'll supply everything, though. So like where there's a chain of ports, you can kind of, assuming you control them, you can supply yourself. But for example, between these, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's clear terrain. Well, if it's clear terrain with roads in the summer, you can reach all the way and attack. But if it doesn't have roads, you can't keep yourself in supply. So you're going to have to bring a baggage train to cover some of that space. We talked about stacking points. Foraging. Each hex has a forage limit. However many units are in that hex, or up to that forage limit, are in supply. However many stacking points up to that forage limit. Anything else, you're going to have to spend your baggage train for. Now, the baggage train comes with empty, and I believe you're allowed to eat it when it's empty and it's just destroyed. It has a supply point in this when it's face down, basically. It has an extra supply point, 2 supply points, and here it has 3 supply points. those supply points can be regenerated fairly easily. It's not easy to regenerate a baggage train if you eat it. A supply point from a baggage train supplies 32 stacking points. Remember, the baggage train itself has to be supplied. You can voluntarily remove supply trains from play, and it is considered a 32 stacking point source of food. And it doesn't have to eat if you eat it. Okay, in sieges, things are a little different. The units outside the city can forage. The units inside get the city forage value. There's a bonus for cities. There is also a siege attrition chart, and the longer that the siege has gone on, the higher the value there. How does that work? Yep. Let's jump over to 17.3 and find that roll. Okay. You roll a die. If siege attrition occurs, 1 unit's destroyed. And then it starts eating through the intrinsic defense. And there's an order of which units have to be destroyed. And basically, they're the biggest stacking units that there are. All right, land combat. Yeah, I don't know how much longer I'm going to make it. I'm awfully tired. It's real late. I took a nap, but okay. Land combat is going to be based on a ratio. You have modifiers based on a number of things. The leaders of the two forces get to use their values as modifiers. A comparison of the combat effectiveness rating of the two forces gives a modifier to the value. You're only going to roll 1 die. The attacker rolls a die. In addition, morale, every 50 points of difference in morale is going to provide a bonus. There's the opportunity to increase your morale temporarily by spending money. We'll talk about that later, but just realize that you could add up to, I think it's $99, which could give you a 2-point swing. But cannot give you more than that. Okay. The defender has the option to retreat before combat unless the attacker has twice as many strength points of cavalry. If the defender retreats before combat, there's some restrictions. You can't cross rivers even. You can't retreat in the direction the enemy came at you. But the big problem with retreating before combat is you lose 5 morale points. Now, if you're going to lose the battle anyway, losing 5 morale points, and you have any significant force, losing 5 morale points is worth it. But if you're not sure, if you have a chance at winning the battle, if the odds are slightly against you, you may want to fight rather than lose those morale points, because morale is very important in this game. Another side of things is you can take a siege. This does not lose your morale. If you're in a space with a city, you can withdraw into it. A siege marker gets put on top. And then the attacker has the option to assault the city, in which case, in the general case, the defender's doubled. But if it's a deforested region, they're tripled. Or if it's barbarians or others who were bad at siege, the defender's tripled. You could split your forces up, have some be attacked outside or retreat before combat, and others, and still take the 5 morale penalty, and have others accept the siege. If the defender retreats before combat, or if there's a siege without an assault, there's not an actual combat, but this qualifies for the attacker requirement to have a combat each turn. If they don't if the phasing player doesn't launch into a combat each turn, they lose morale. Okay. So the results here are given E in elimination. A says whatever the attacker lost, the defender has to lose as many strength points or more. D, the opposite. Then there are some, hey, like 3/4 D. You have to lose 3/4 what the defender lost. Fairly simple. Ends do nothing. A bold result means you won the battle. There is always a bold result. The other guy is going to have to retreat after combat. We talked about CER combination there, or matrix, whatever. Eliminated units are able to be rebuilt. Fleets. Okay, fleets can be involved in a land combat. A fleet's land combat strength is 1/4 its naval strength. If they're part of a force that retreats, they can split up. If there are land units embarked on a fleet and land units participate in land combat, they're disembarked. The weird thing there are some issues about this rule. There's questions in the errata, or there's issues brought up in the errata, and I'm not quite sure how this all plays out, because you can't do an amphibious invasion without certain conditions being met. But this makes it seem like you can kind of drop troops in a battle, and the errata makes it even more clear that you can. So we have to deal with that. The fleet units will have their strength quartered for taking losses in terms of the effect on anything else. Somewhere there was a retreat after combat, wasn't there? Yeah. The losing force must retreat. If they cannot retreat, they lose half their remaining points. Cav superiority doesn't do anything about this. 14.24. Yeah, restrictions on where you can retreat. Okay. Now, each unit's stacking value is basically the morale points that the unit is worth. If you lose those units, pretty much for any reason, you take morale losses for them. If you destroy units in combat or other combat-like activities of an enemy, you gain the morale points for that. So you can immediately see the morale swings hugely on a battle. A major battle can significantly change the morale. And the morale, like I said, is very important in this game. In particular, if your morale drops to 0, there is certain powers will dissolve, will disappear from the game, and their force gets split up by other players. In particular, the Civil War powers do. So a civil war can be decided by a single battle. Now the other thing is seasoning. If you have lower strength, if you have weaker unseasoned units involved in a battle, you can season as many strength points of those as the total combat strength point of the enemy force. But this doesn't happen unless you roll the dice for the battle. All right. I need to swap batteries, and I don't know how much longer I can go. In addition to cities providing a siege benefit, they also have an actual strength bonus, strength points. And we have a list of cities here with their tax and defense strength, but this is an optional rule, and then all the minor cities and non-city ports have their own there. I'm looking to see. Okay, so the general rule is 1 for minor and 3 for major cities. I don't know if I want to deal with that, the complexity of specific lookups for the value on them like that. That may be going a bit too far for what I want to get out of the game, even though it's part of that research work is having found that out. We talked about deforestation already. Okay. If you are the defender in a hex and you withdraw into the city, the attacker has the option to siege you. If the strength of the besieging force is ever less than 1/4 of the unmodified combat strength of the besieging units, the siege can't actually happen, and it would break due to that. You can siege an empty city. It has its own defensive value, so you might not be able to take it normally. The besieging units can come out and fight, and they can do this in conjunction with other units in their hex. Coordination difficulties be damned. If you are aided by additional units and make an attack, and that attack's repulsed, the additional units can't enter the city. The units in the city can't escape. Okay. In order, if you've got more fleets than the besieging force, you've blockaded the port. Normally, fleets are immune to Rule 10.26. What the hell? Yeah. So if you're blockading a port, you don't have to return to a friendly port. You can stay on a blockade. At the end of naval operations each winter, though, you have to make a naval attrition roll, just as if you had moved. And you get a penalty when you move, which is on the chart. If the port's not blockaded, it can be a supply source under normal port supply rules, which means if it can go to another port in the same sea. And the Mediterranean's split up into different zones. Besieged fleets can engage besieging fleets during naval operations and vice versa. They're both considered to be out there and ready to fight. Unless the port is blockaded, fleets may freely enter or leave the port, transporting land units in either direction. A non-city port can't be besieged. There are some of these around. In fact, the pirates are sitting on a lot of them. That's a city. This one has no city involved with it. I don't know if you can see. And but it's got a port. That actually has a strength point for combat, but it just can't be besieged because it doesn't have walls. Siege attrition, we already talked about that a little bit. And that just kills a unit, and if there are no units left, it starts chipping away the intrinsic defense of the city. And if that eventually goes down to 0, the city just surrenders. Oh, all right. I think we load up here because although I mean, this isn't going to take 2 hours, another hour, but I think it's best to keep the videos a little shorter. So let's end this up.